Okay, let's start with something we all just, take for granted. How do you actually perceive the world around you? I
Wow.
think for most of us, we just assume our eyes are like passive cameras. They just record the light that hits the retina and then, poof.
The world just appears.
Exactly. The world pops into your consciousness, fully formed, a perfect copy of what's out there. You open your eyes and you just receive the image.
But we know that's wrong.
Completely wrong. Decades of cognitive science, of neuroscience, have shown that this passive camera idea just doesn't hold up. Perception is, it's intensely constructive.
I mean, your mind is actively building the reality you experience. It's extrapolating way beyond the messy, patchy, ambiguous information that's actually hitting your senses.
And what's really fascinating about that is just how old this idea is.
Oh, it's ancient. This isn't some, new discovery from an fMRI machine.
Right.
Recognizing that perception is a constructive act goes back centuries. It's a core problem in philosophy. You have historical figures who understood just how hard vision is, computationally.
Like, who are we talking about here?
Well, think of Al-Haytham back in the 11th century. He was showing that vision involves judgment and inference, not just passive perception. Or Hermann von Helmholtz in the 19th century.
With his unconscious inferences.
Exactly. He pointed out that we see a stable three-dimensional world from these flat two-dimensional patterns of light on our retinas that are constantly shifting every time our eyes move.
Or how we see smooth motion from just a series of snapshots.
Right. That all requires this immense, tireless, constructive work from the brain to fill in the gaps and supplement the, frankly, pretty poor information it's getting.
And this is where, historically, the idea of the imagination comes into play.
That's it. For a lot of classical philosophers, if perception was constructive, it had to rely on some faculty that could bridge that gap between just raw sensation and, understanding.
And they landed on imagination.
They did. People like David Hume and Immanuel Kant, they specifically linked this fundamental constructive power to the faculty of imagination.
How so? What was Hume's take?
Well, Hume saw imagination as the key thing for associating ideas, for bridging the gaps between all our disconnected sensations. It let us perceive, say, a continuous object or a causal event, even when our senses only gave us these discrete little moments.
And Kant.
For Kant, it was even more fundamental. He saw imagination as a transcendental necessity. He called it the schematism. It's what brings all the necessary structure, like time and space, to the raw, unstructured sensory input.
So in that tradition, the imagination isn't just for, daydreaming about winning the lottery. It's an active ingredient in making reality.
Precisely. P.F. Strawson summarized it perfectly. He said that in this tradition, the imagination is not merely causally operative, so it's not just something that helps you see, but it's alive in the present perception.
It's a component part of the experience.
An inseparable component.
But then modern cognitive science sort of went in the other direction, didn't it? We largely separated these two things.
We did. We started talking about quintessentially perceptual processes, things like edge detection, Gestalt grouping, Bayesian inference. And we said those things were doing the constructive work.
Automatically, non-consciously.
Right. We built this whole scientific field dedicated to explaining how the brain gets from the stimulus to the perception without needing to drag the imagination into it.
And that's where the controversy is today, because now there's this really strong philosophical movement pushing back.
A huge pushback. We can call it the Constitutive View. And it's advocating for a forceful return to that older unified idea.
So what's their core claim?
Proponents like Ben Stanay, Derek Brown, Amy Kind, they're arguing that the separation was a mistake. They claim that most of our perceptual experiences are literally infused with or constituted by mental imagery.
Wow. So they're saying imagistic elements are like routine ingredients in what we see every day.
And necessary ingredients. And that perception and imagination are really just points on a single continuum.
That changes everything. I mean, if my visual experience of this microphone right now is partly my imagination, what does that even mean?
Well, it means we have to completely rethink the tools of vision science. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack this really powerful, really ambitious constitutive view.
Okay.
We need to understand the very expansive definition of imagery they're using. And then, and this is the crucial part, we have to challenge whether that definition actually holds up as a unified explanatory concept.
Uh-huh.
We're looking at a recent source that just systematically dismantles the philosophical and empirical foundations of this view.
And for you, the listener, what are the stakes here? I mean, why should we care if a philosopher calls part of our vision imagination?
Oh, the stakes are enormous. It goes way beyond just labeling parts of the brain. On a scientific level, if the constitutive view is right, it means research into perception has to rely heavily on research into the imagination. It forces this deep unification of two fields that are, right now, pretty distinct.
But there's a deeper philosophical problem, isn't there?
There is. It really raises fundamental questions about how reliable our perception is as a source of knowledge.
I can see that. If perception is constructive, okay, that's just the brain being clever. But if the construction relies on the imagination, which, we normally associate with fantasy, with creativity.
The things that aren't real.
Right. Then my perception might not be fundamentally committed to accurately representing the world anymore.
Exactly. Imagination is characteristically unbound to the facts. It's flexible, it's goal-driven, it's often creative. Perception, on the other hand, is supposed to be mandatory, constrained, committed to reality.
So if my perception is constantly being infused with my imagination, how can I trust it?
How can we establish the epistemic priority of perception over, say, just memory or guesswork? The reliability we grant our senses is tied directly to how rigid and automatic those constructive processes are. If those processes start to look like imagination, then we have a major epistemological problem. This is a deep dive into the very architecture of how we experience the world.
Okay, so let's start by drawing a clear line. We need to separate the uncontroversial relationship between perception and imagery from this new, really radical claim. So 2 views on the table. First, the causal view.
The causal view is pretty straightforward, and it's well established empirically.
No one really argues with this one.
No, it just states that imagery can causally affect perception, and perception can affect imagery. It's an interaction.
Okay, give me an example.
So if you visualize a baseball flying towards you, that act of visualization can actually speed up your reaction time when a real ball appears. It primes the system.
It can improve your detection.
Exactly. And we know this causal link is real because imagery can even induce perceptual after effects.
Like the classic waterfall illusion.
Precisely. You stare at a waterfall for a minute, then you look at the rocks next to it, and the rocks appear to be moving upward. That's an after effect in your motion processing areas.
An adaptation.
Right. And what's remarkable is that just visualizing continuous downward motion for a while can produce the exact same illusion. A stationary thing will look like it's moving up.
So that's a clear causal link. The visualization caused a perceptual effect.
And it's not surprising, really. Neuroimaging studies, going back to Koslin and others, have shown for a long time that imagery and perception use a lot of the same neural machinery. There's overlapping activation in early visual areas. But again, this is just a causal link. Input A influences output B. It's not controversial.
Okay, so then we get to the high-stakes claim, the constitutive view. This is much, much stronger.
Much stronger. The claim here is that imagery is not merely causally operative, not just an input affecting an output, but that it is an ingredient. It's a component part of the present perception itself.
So it's baked in.
It's baked in. The proponents argue that most of our perceptual representations are like composite patchworks. The imagistic bit is a necessary condition for the perception to be what it is.
Like salt in a soup.
Exactly. You can't just take the salt out and have the same soup. It fundamentally changes the experience. Take the imagery away, and you have a fundamentally different perception.
For a claim that radical to cover pretty much all of our waking vision, they must have to define imagery in a really broad way. It can't just be about me deciding to picture a beach.
They absolutely have to. And this brings us to their foundational definition. The decoupling account of imagery.
The decoupling account.
It defines mental imagery very simply and very negatively. It is any perceptual representation that is not directly triggered by sensory input.
So it's defined by what it isn't.
It's defined by being causally decoupled from what's hitting your retina at that exact moment.
Okay, let me make that concrete. So right now I'm looking at you. The image of you is directly triggered.
Right.
If I close my eyes and try to remember what you look like, that's imagery, because it's decoupled from the real-time sensory input.
That's the canonical voluntary case, yes.
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense.
I see where this is going.
That definition casts a huge net. It sweeps in a lot more than just voluntary stuff. It includes phenomena that seem completely automatic, completely involuntary things we usually just think of as core vision science.
Like, what else gets caught in that net?
Well, proponents like Joel Pearson They recognize this. They call these things automatic visual imagery or non-retinal phantom vision. And this broad scope is critical for their whole argument because it's how they capture all those constructive processes we talked about.
So what's on the list?
First, perceptual completion. This is how we see an object as a whole thing, even when it's partly blocked.
The cat behind the picket fence.
The cat behind the picket fence. You perceive a continuous whole cat, even though your sensory input is just a series of disconnected cat strips. Since the parts behind the fence slats aren't directly sensed.
They have to be imagery.
Under this definition, yes. Then there's filling in the blind spot.
Right, the spot where the optic nerve leaves the eye.
Exactly. You don't walk around with a big black hole in your vision. Your visual system automatically fills it in with whatever texture or color is around it. That filled-in patch is not directly sensed.
So it's imagery.
And then there's filling in the visual periphery. Your vision is only sharp and detailed in a tiny little spot in the center, the fovea. Out on the edges, the input is really coarse. But our experience feels pretty detailed all over.
So that extra detail, the extra specificity.
Like seeing crimson when the input only specified red. That, according to the decoupling account, has to be imagery.
Okay, so the motivation is clear now. Proponents like Nane can say, look, things like Amodal completion and filling in happen constantly. They're ubiquitous.
Therefore, imagery must be a ubiquitous ingredient of perception. They build their whole case for the constitutive view by simply defining the constructive parts of vision as imagery.
If seeing a cut partially behind a book counts as using my imagination, then yeah, my perception is perpetually infused with it.
Precisely. But here is the central challenge that our source material raises. For the constitutive view to be a substantive scientific claim, for it to be more than just, a word game.
A relabeling exercise.
Exactly. For it to be more than that, this huge, expansive category that they've created has to constitute a unified natural kind.
A unified natural kind. Okay, that sounds like a big philosophical term. What does it mean in practice?
It's so important. The natural kind thesis just means that the decoupling account has to be picking out a class of things. This giant bucket with voluntary visualization, hallucinations, working memory, blind spot filling, and Amodal completion all thrown in together.
And all those things have to share interesting or important properties.
Yes, properties that are projectable. That means they support strong inductions, they can be part of new generalizations, they're explanatorily useful, and, crucially, they let you make new predictions.
So if you group together me picturing a flying car, a hallucination, and the automatic process that fills in my blind spot, they have to share some deep properties that distinguish them from regular perception.
And those properties have to give us a unified explanation for why they all behave the way they do. If they don't, then the category is just a jumble. It's just a heap. And the concept of imagery becomes scientifically useless.
So the critique isn't saying imagery and perception are totally separate. It's arguing that if you define the overlap this broadly, based only on the absence of something,
you risk collapsing a bunch of very different psychological processes into one meaningless umbrella term.
You risk saying that a goal-directed creative visualization is the same kind of thing as a low-level retinal reflex.
Just because they both happen to lack a direct sensory trigger. And that lack of unity is going to become a huge problem when we look at the data. But first, the theory has to even define its own borders successfully.
Okay, let's drill down on that border. The decoupling account tries to draw this nice, clean line. Imagery is indirectly triggered, perception proper is directly triggered. But vision science tells us perception is a messy business. How does that clean line hold up against the reality of sensory processing?
This is where the whole thing faces a really profound logical dilemma.
Because perception is never just local.
Almost never, if ever. It's not an isolated product of one photoreceptor firing. As the Gestalt psychologist showed us a century ago, what you see in one part of a scene is constantly and fundamentally influenced by everything else around it. Contextual effects are pervasive.
It's all connected.
Completely. Irvin Rock put it really well. He said local stimuli don't predict what you perceive because the local input is always ambiguous. Its meaning, its effect, depends entirely on the surrounding context.
So if context is everywhere, the constitutive view has a massive problem. How do you define direct triggering without basically saying all of vision is imagery?
They're in a bind. They had to create a distinction between contextual modification, where perception is just influenced by context but is still directly triggered, and contextual triggering, where one representation causes another one, and that counts as imagery.
So they're trying to save a little patch of land for perception proper.
They are. Nene tries to make this distinction. He says a representation is directly triggered if it's produced without the mediation of top-down or lateral processes. But then he puts complex things like filling in the blind spot or a modal completion firmly in the contextual triggering camp.
And why? What's the logic there?
Because the representations of the visible parts of the cat mediate the representation of the hidden parts. The visible bits cause the hidden bits to appear in your perception.
Okay, but hang on. If that kind of mediation counts as imagery, what about all the really basic, low-level stuff the visual system does all the time? Surely those basic neural interactions have to count as perception proper, or the term just becomes meaningless.
That is the heart of the challenge. We need to look at some examples of contextual modification that the Constitutive View must classify as non-imagistic for their theory to even make sense.
Okay.
Let's look at two classic, rock-solid phenomena from early vision: mock bands and divisive normalization.
Let's start with mock bands.
Okay, so mock bands come from a fundamental low-level process called lateral inhibition.
This happens right in the retina, right?
Right in the retina and early visual cortex. If you look at a gradient, say a light gray strip, next to a slightly darker gray strip, your visual system artificially enhances the contrast right at the border.
You see these little phantom bands?
You see a thin phantom dark band on the dark side of the edge and a phantom light band on the light side. They aren't physically there in the stimulus.
That sounds incredibly constructive. It's literally creating something that isn't there.
It is, but the mechanism is purely low level, and it's mandatory. Neurons that are next to each other inhibit one another. It's a basic feature of the wiring.
Okay, what about divisive normalization?
Divisive normalization is another one of these foundational mechanisms. If you look at a patch of a striked pattern, a grading, the perceived contrast of that center patch will look lower if it's surrounded by other similar high-contrast stripes.
It's a kind of suppression.
Center surround suppression, exactly. It's a crucial way the visual system manages redundancy and focuses its resources. So both of these MAC bands and divisive normalization are paradigm cases of contextual modification. They're fixed, mandatory processes that alter representation based on what's around it.
So the Constitutive View has to say these are not imagery.
They must. If lateral inhibition is imagination, then there's basically no perception that isn't imagery, and the whole claim just becomes a really complicated way of saying vision is constructive, which we already knew.
It becomes trivial.
It becomes trivial. But now we hit the dilemma, and it all comes down to how finely you choose to individuate your perceptual representations.
What do you mean by that?
It's about how you label the output. Would the process have produced the same representation if the context had been different?
Oh, this feels like a trap. If we use the fine-grained labels that vision scientists use, then isn't every single influence from context going to count as triggering a different representation?
That is precisely the consequence of taking a fine-grained approach, which is the normal scientific way to do it. Let's go back to that contrast example.
Okay.
When the high-contrast surround suppresses the center patch, the visual system forms a representation, let's call it C2, that assigns a lower contrast value than it would have without the surround. Without the surround, it would have formed representation C1.
Okay, C1 and C2 are different.
There are different representations of contrast. Now, we ask, was the production of C2 directly triggered? Well, no. It was mediated by the lateral processing of the surround.
So the context, the surround, triggered the C2 representation instead of the C1 representation.
And if that's your logic, then you have to conclude that all contextual modification, mock bands, center surround suppression, everything is imagery, because the final representation was causally mediated by other representations.
Which leaves you with basically nothing left for perception proper.
It leaves you with this rarefied conception of non-imagistic perception that's completely irrelevant to vision science, because vision science is the study of context. It defines perception proper into non-existence.
So to save their theory, they have to abandon that precise scientific way of labeling things and adopt a coarse-grained definition.
They're forced to. They'd have to argue that C1 and C2 are, just instances of the same coarse type, like representation of contrast in general. At that abstract level, you can say the center patch representation is produced no matter what, so it's directly triggered.
That saves perception proper.
It does. But
if they do that, if they blur the definitions that much, doesn't that immediately blow up the examples they want to use to prove their case?
Absolutely. The coarse graining strategy immediately backfires on the very phenomena they want to claim as imagery. Think back to one of Nene's key examples, filling in the peripheral vision.
Right. The sparse input in the periphery just says red, but your experience is crimson.
And Nane argues that added specificity, that move from red to crimson, is the imagistic part.
I see the bind.
But if you adopt a coarse-grained definition that's broad enough to lump C1 and C2 contrast levels together, treating them as the same type of representation,
Then you would also have to lump red and crimson together, since crimson is just a more specific kind of red.
it's a true logical bind. You either have to coarsen the definition so much that you exclude your own key examples, or you have to keep it fine-grained and trivialize your entire theory. The core concept of direct triggering, that they need to separate normal context from imagery, it just hasn't been clearly or principledly identified. It's unworkable.
So the definitional border is a mess. It seems logically impossible to draw. That's problem number one. But let's just, for the sake of argument, say we could wave a magic wand and draw that line.
Okay.
We'd still have to ask if the stuff we put in the non-directly triggered bucket actually forms a meaningful, unified category. Is there any explanatory coherence there?
And this brings us to the second major challenge, which is really a test of scientific usefulness. We can call it the flat-nosed animal test.
The flat-nosed animal test.
It's a thought experiment from John Stuart Mill and later Quine. And it argues that a definition based on a negative, on an exclusion, rarely gives you a useful scientific kind.
How does the example work?
It's simple. Just because you can define the category flat-nosed animal as the complement of non-flat-nosed animal, it doesn't mean it's a real kind. You have to ask, do all flat-nosed animals, pugs, primates, flounders, share any common properties that are distinctive to that group, other than the properties they share with all animals?
So applying that here, do all the non-directly triggered things, the hallucinations, the voluntary visualizations, the automatic blind spot filling, do they share properties that are distinctive of imagery, beyond the properties they just share with all perceptual representations?
That's the question. And when you look at the immense scope of the category the decoupling count creates, you immediately see how wildly different the members are.
I mean, it's a real grab bag.
A huge one. You have one, perceptual malfunction. Things like hallucinations, which are decoupled from reality and often signal pathology.
Okay.
2, you have voluntary, flexible, goal-directed processes, like me deciding to visualize a complex golf swing or a fictional dragon.
And then the third bucket.
3, you have involuntary, automatic, inflexible processes, things like the physiological mechanism for filling in the blind spot or a modal completion, or even just maintaining an image in visual working memory.
It seems almost impossible that you could find a strong, substantive, scientific generalization that would cover all three of those so differently.
Well, the proponents of the constitutive view, they do point to the similarities they do share. And they're right to an extent. They note that both imagery and perception use common neural areas, like the visual cortex.
Right, we mentioned the Koslin studies.
And they share general constraints, like the capacity limits of attention and working memory. And as we said, imagery can cause adaptation after effects. So there are overlaps.
But hang on. Those features, neural overlap, capacity limits, adaptation, they sound like they're just markers of perceptual representation in general.
That is the essential counterargument. That's the flat-nosed test in action. If these features hold true for all perceptual processing, then they aren't distinctive markers of the imagistic kind. We need generalizations that cover the whole category of imagery without also covering all of perception proper.
So how do we test that?
A great way to test this is to look at individuals who claim they can't produce conscious visual imagery. It's a condition called aphantasia.
Okay.
If imagery is a unified kind, then aphantasic individuals should show strong, correlated problems across all the phenomena that the decoupling account labels as imagery.
And what does the evidence show?
The evidence from aphantasia shows really critical dissociations that directly challenge this natural kind thesis.
Okay, so what's the evidence that supports the unity, even partially?
Well, aphantasia is sometimes linked with having less detailed episodic memories. That suggests a link between visual reconstruction and memory. And they sometimes show reduced susceptibility to certain illusions that seem to rely on top-down filling in, like neon color spreading. So there are some links.
But the dissociations, the things that challenge the unity, are more powerful.
Much more powerful. And we see them as soon as we look at tasks that are, by definition, imagistic, but are functionally very different from voluntary visualization.
Let's take the first one, visual working memory, or VWM.
Okay, so VWM is your ability to hold and manipulate a little bit of visual information for a few seconds after it's gone. And neuroscience shows this involves keeping a pattern of activity going in your early visual cortex for seconds after the stimulus vanishes.
So wait, if a representation is being sustained in the visual cortex without any sensory input to keep it there,
Then it perfectly meets the decoupling account's definition of imagery. It's a perceptual representation sustained without the relevant sensory input.
which means if imagery is a unified kind, people with aphantasia who report no conscious imagery should be really bad at VWM tasks.
Their performance should be terrible. The neural activity supporting it should be different.
Yeah.
No. And this is a devastating blow to the unified kind thesis. Recent studies show that behavioral performance on VWM tasks is pretty much the same for aphantasics and non-aphantasics.
Wow.
And even more tellingly, you can decode the content of what they're holding in their working memory from their early visual cortex activity with equal accuracy for both strong imagers and people with aphantasia.
So let me get this straight. A process that perfectly fits their definition of imagery. A sustained perceptual representation without a stimulus shows no correlation with the subjective experience of conscious imagery.
None. And that's critical because it implies that the mechanism for sustaining a representation, VWM, is functionally and psychologically distinct from the mechanism for voluntarily creating or experiencing conscious imagery.
If they were the same kind of thing, they should go up and down together.
They should correlate strongly. Since they don't, the decoupling account had just grouped two different mechanisms under one label. It fails the flat-nosed animal test.
Okay, what's the second key dissociation?
Scaffolded attention. This is a cool phenomenon. If you stare at a really regular, repetitive texture like bathroom tiles or a rug, you can start to see illusory patterns or shapes pop out.
Even though there's nothing in the tiles themselves that makes those patterns?
Right. The representation of those groupings is constructed by your visual system. It's not directly triggered by local cues. So again, it fits the decoupling account's definition of imagery.
So the hypothesis would be that people who are good at visualizing should be more likely to see these patterns.
That was the hypothesis.
Yeah.
But studies found no correlation. Your susceptibility to this phenomenon does not correlate with your mental imagery vividness scores.
So again, a process that is non-directly triggered is functionally dissociated from our main measure of voluntary imagination.
It's another clean break. You have VWM, you have scaffolded attention, you have the automatic nature of blind spot filling. All of them are non-directly triggered, but none of them show a reliable correlation with voluntary imagination.
It's a complete failure of the flat nose test.
It is. And the source material argues that the few correlations that are found, like the neural overlap, can be explained much more simply. They're probably just features of the broader, more unified kind that they all belong to, which is perceptual processing in general.
The category is just too broad to be useful.
Exactly. The term imagery loses all its explanatory power when it covers everything from a creative, goal-directed activity to an inflexible, automatic physiological reflex. To claim it's a unified kind based only on what it lacks is to ignore all the functional and empirical differences that actually define these processes.
Okay, so now we get to the absolute heart of the Constitutive View's best argument. This is their strongest piece of evidence. The ubiquity of amodal completion.
Amodal completion, or AC.
And the reasoning is, on the surface, really persuasive. We are constantly seeing whole, intact objects, even when they're partially blocked by something else.
All day, every day.
And since the hidden parts aren't being directly sensed, that filling in must be imagery. And if that is imagery, then our perception is just fundamentally infused with imagination.
It's definitely their strongest case, because occlusion is just a constant feature of our visual world.
So how does the critique dismantle this?
The source material argues against classifying AC as imagery by showing that its deep explanatory home, its real family, lies with processes that are unquestionably perception proper.
So it's more like them than it is like daydreaming.
Much more. And we're focusing here on local completion, the systematic geometric kind of filling in, not the more cognitive kind of guessing based on memory.
So what's the evidence for this kinship? Where does AC belong?
Well, it has a deep kinship on two levels. First, with how we perceive object parthood, and second, with contour integration.
Okay, let's start with parthood. How we see the parts of an object.
Right. The modern theory of local completion really took off by generalizing from how we perceive parts. Psychologists like Donald Hoffman and Whitney Richards, they identified key geometric cues the visual system uses to structure a scene.
Like T-junctions.
Exactly. When two surfaces intersect, you get these tangent discontinuities, the corners or T-junctions you see when a vertical line seems to end where it meets a horizontal one. The visual system uses those junctions as mandatory low-level geometric cues to figure out the 3D structure.
And how does that connect to occlusion?
Well, Kelman and Shipley extended this idea. They show that an occluding setup, like a vertical bar blocking a horizontal one, creates junction types that are geometrically almost identical to an interpenetrating one. The key insight is that both a modal completion filling in the hidden line and parthood perception rely on linking these sharp corners or T-junctions according to very strict geometric rules.
So the models that explain this are all about geometry and algorithms.
All about geometry. They don't reference visualization or memory or dreaming. It suggests AC is driven by mandatory low-level rules, not flexible imaginative content.
Okay, so that's the first family connection. What's the second?
The second is its kinship with contour integration, or CI. Contour integration is the process where your visual system groups neighboring visible parts of a contour together.
Like seeing a dotted line as one continuous line.
Exactly. And CI is a paradigm case of perception proper. It's directly triggered by the sensory input, and it happens automatically.
But AC is about filling in hidden parts, and CI is about connecting visible parts. How are they unified?
They share common mechanisms, and they're explained by the same computational models. And the key empirical work here comes from Kelman and Fuchser. They demonstrated that both processes, interpolation for AC and integration for CI, depend on the exact same cues and constraints.
So they follow the same rule book.
It's the exact same rule book. Local completion and integration only happen when the visible edges are relatable, and that's defined by a very strict geometric rule. The two segments have to be connectable by a smooth curve that doesn't bend more than 90 degrees.
If the corner's too sharp, the system gives up.
It gives up. It assumes there were two separate objects, not one continuous occluded one. And Kelman and Fuchser show that the system's ability to do both filling in and connecting the dots declines with statistically identical precision as the segments get more misaligned.
That's very powerful evidence for a shared mechanism. If a modal completion shares its core rules and constraints with contour integration, which is definitely perception proper,
then the most logical and explanatorily useful move is to classify AC as a highly constrained form of contextual processing, as perception proper.
you gain explanatory unity by grouping it with CI.
Absolutely. And now, contrast that with voluntary imagery. When you compare local completion to you deciding to visualize something, the difference is just night and day. It's all about constraints versus freedom.
My voluntary imagination doesn't have to obey the 90-degree rule.
Not at all. It runs completely free of those constraints. You can visualize a hidden puppeteer holding two puppets, even if the visible contours of the puppets have no systematic geometric relationship at all.
It's totally flexible.
It's flexible, it's goal-directed, it reflects your internal intent. Local completion is an inflexible, automatic, constrained reflex that reflects mandatory geometry. It's more like engineering than daydreaming.
So to classify local completion as the same kind of thing as voluntary visualization.
Brings you zero explanatory gain. In fact, it undermines our understanding of the very processes that make our perceptions so reliable and stable. That huge difference in functional constraints between AC and visualization would be a complete mystery if the decoupling account were true. And so the cornerstone of their whole argument, a modal completion, actually fails to support it.
Okay, so let's recap. We've laid out two huge problems for the constitutive view. First, the decoupling account creates this unworkable, blurry border between imagery and all the normal contextual influences in vision.
Right, like lateral inhibition.
And second, the huge category of things it creates, this big bucket of non-directly triggered stuff, it lacks any theoretical unity. It fails the flat-nosed animal test based on the evidence from aphantasia and visual working memory.
So the bottom line seems to be that constructive perception is its own thing. It's a distinct psychological kind, and it's best understood on its own terms.
So if we're going to throw out the decoupling account, what should we replace it with? How should we define mental imagery?
Well, the source suggests that if we want to define imagery as a unified, cohesive kind, we need to stop defining it negatively, by what it lacks, its disconnect from the stimulus.
And instead define it by what it has.
By its internal qualities or its function. We should focus on its connection to things like agency or subjective experience. And the philosophical literature has several alternative approaches that do this really well. They capture what we intuitively call imagination, while correctly classifying those constructive visual reflexes as perception proper.
Okay, what are these alternatives that avoid the pitfalls?
The first one we can call the phenomenological contrast. This view, you see it in thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, suggests that imagery is distinguished by the absence of the feeling of presence.
Feeling of presence.
Yeah, that robust, immediate sense that the object you're perceiving is actually out there in your environment right now, grounding your actions. Perception proper, whether it's seeing a tree or hearing a noise, always has this feeling of presence.
So if I visualize a flying car, it feels internal, like an effort. If I look at a real car, it just feels external and immediate.
Exactly. So if that's your criterion, what do you do with a modal completion?
Well, when I see the cat behind the fence, the completed cat feels like it's really there. It feels present.
It does. It doesn't feel like a guess or a memory.
Yeah.
It feels structurally rigid, as if it's just waiting for the fence to move. Voluntary visualization doesn't have that feeling of external commitment. So this view would classify local completion as non-imagistic perception, flatly rejecting the core claim of the Constitutive View on phenomenological grounds.
That seems a lot cleaner than trying to measure some mysterious, direct causal connection between neurons. What's the second alternative?
The second one focuses on flexibility and modularity. This is a classic idea from cognitive science. The idea is that core constructive perceptual processes, like local completion or center-surround suppression, are highly inflexible and modular.
Meaning they operate automatically.
Automatically and mandatorily. They are totally insensitive to your goals, your beliefs, your expectations. You can't just will the mock bands to go away. You can't decide to ignore the amodal completion constraints.
But the imagination is the complete opposite of modular.
Exactly. Imagery operates within non-modular cognitive processes.
Yeah.
It's initiated and flexibly shaped by your aims, your goals, your expectations. You decide what colors and shapes to visualize. So that gives you a clear functional distinction. Perception proper is mandatory and rigid. Imagination is goal-driven and adaptive.
Local completion has to follow the 90-degree rule. My visualization of a unicorn does not.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
What's the third distinction? The third focuses on agential activity. This suggests that imagery is fundamentally something the subject does. It's an activity, a performance that requires some kind of mental effort. Ordinary perception, by contrast, is something that just happens to you, like a reflex.
But what about involuntary things, like a song stuck in your head or an image that just pops into your mind? That feels like it's happening to you.
That's a great point, and there's a refinement here. While the earworm might arise unbidden, you can still sensibly try to stop it. You can try to modify it or redirect your attention away from it. That capacity for attempted control links even involuntary imagery back to agency and your goals.
And you can't do that with a perceptual reflex.
You can't try to stop lateral inhibition or local completion. It just operates regardless of your will.
So what's the common thread that unites these three alternatives? Phenomenology, modularity, and agency.
They all shift the definition of imagery away from its relationship to the stimulus, which is the decoupling account's focus, and toward its connection to agency, goals, or subjective experience.
And this maintains that crucial distinction.
It maintains the distinction that imagery, unlike perception proper, is not essentially committed to representing the world as it is. It's flexible, it's unbound, it reflects the internal state of the subject, and it's something we do. Perception proper is constrained, mandatory, and committed to accurately reflecting external reality. This whole framework avoids all the logical and empirical problems of the decoupling account, while still fully acknowledging the constructive nature of vision.
This has been a really profound deep dive. We've gone into the very ingredients of our conscious experience, and it seems the effort by the Constitutive View to unify perception and imagination under this one sweeping negative definition.
The decoupling account.
It just risks collapsing two very distinct psychological kinds. And more importantly, it risks losing sight of the very specific, highly constrained processes that make our constructive perceptions so effective and, so reliable.
And that's the core takeaway from the source material. A scientific definition has to be useful. It has to help you explain things and make predictions. If your expansive definition of imagery groups a voluntary thought about a fictional flying car with the automatic brain process that helps you see a continuous cat behind a fence, what unified predictive property are you actually studying?
There's nothing holding them together.
Nothing useful. The explanatory power you get by grouping a modal completion with contour integration based on their shared geometric rules is just so much greater than the power you get by grouping it with hallucinations or daydreaming. Constructive processing and perception is its own special kind of thing, and we should study it on its own terms.
It's so tempting to just lump all the non-directly sensed information together and call it imagination. I can see why, especially with the history from Hume and Kant.
It's an easy move.
But when we do that, we ignore all the specialized and flexible machinery, the specific geometry, the 90-degree rule, the mandatory neural processes that ensures our perception of the world isn't just constantly being overridden by our desires, our memories, or our wishful thinking.
And that functional distinction leads us to our final provocative thought for you to take away. If our ability to perceive the world accurately depends on these highly specific, inflexible, constructive processes that operate completely outside of our goals and expectation processes that look nothing like visualization,
Then what's the question?
the question is, how does the brain do it? How does it manage to keep our highly flexible, goal-driven imagination from constantly overriding or polluting our accurate representations of reality? That strict, enforced border between constrained, constructive perception and creative, unbound thought that remains one of the deepest mysteries in the cognitive science of consciousness.
A mystery we can all think about the next time we see an object behind a fence or get fooled by an optical illusion. And just appreciate how hard our mind is working to keep a consistent, rigid, and reliable external reality in place for us.